Hello, and welcome back to the Stories of Northern Life podcast, brought to you by the Sault Ste. Marie Museum. I'm your host, Nicole, and today we are going to be doing a book review. So the book we are going to be reviewing is The Border at Sault Ste. Marie by Graham S. Mount, John Abbott, and Michael Malloy. The book was published in 1995 by Dundurn Press. First, we have the introduction. So you can see here, there's a nice map showcasing the area that we're going to be looking at today. The introduction is talking about the two Sault Ste. Maries, 1796 to 1996. So not only did they choose to start here because the dates line up, but also because we see that 1996 is the year that the Northwest Company moved to the North Shore, as per Jay's Treaty, as we know. And this was sort of the time that we see the beginnings of a divide between the two cities, because we're having to move sort of a British business to the north side, which is the British side. And also here they're saying we are a unique border town because we share a name other than Niagara Falls, but also for the fact that the Canadian city is larger. And here it also says that the book will, quote, examine the border culture and the transboundary ties of the two communities, end quote. So then we're moving into the first chapter, which looks at the beginnings. So we only have a short little paragraph here talking about the Indigenous history, and then this next paragraph is all talking about the French history here. And so it doesn't mention a Tambourlais, and it quickly goes through the arrival of the Jesuits, them setting up a mission here, the pageant of St. Luçon, and then finally all the way up until the French came back and they set up Fort Repentier. And then the chapter finishes off talking about how after the war where Wolfe defeated Montcalm, the area switched from French hands to British. The second chapter is all about the War of 1812. So there's a whole chapter just looking at this, just because this was sort of a unique point where the two cities were basically working together. But then we see after the War of 1812, this is where things sort of start to change just a little bit. That border that was established with the American War of Independence, it was then sort of reinforced by the end of the War of 1812. And so this chapter here talks a little bit more about how we start to see that border becoming a little bit more defined, I guess you can say. Then we have the economic stagnation part. And so this is the period sort of after the War of 1812 up to the mid to late 1800s. And so as we know, with the Hudson's Bay Company sort of buying out and taking over the Northwest Company, the trade routes through this area were sort of abandoned, and that did affect both Saults. And then we have a chapter on guns and violence. And this chapter here, it's where we learn that the arrival of Major Joseph Wilson, who was the Customs and Revenue Agent, really helped to bring about a distinction between the two Sioux. So he was really wanting to celebrate the British pride. So every Victoria Day, he would fire off a cannon, and that practice continued on all the way up into her death in 1901. And then another example is that after a British victory, he held a celebration here in the Sioux. So he was really trying to establish a sense of British identity separate from feeling like a remote part of the US. And then after that, the book goes on to talk about Colonel John Prince. So yes, he is a little bit more of a Canadian figure, but we only sort of briefly look at him as sort of barely 2 pages. And it's also sort of talking about his views on the States, which were not positive because he didn't have many positive views of this area regardless. And then we're moving on to Confederation and looking at how instead of a sense of British identity, we're starting to now come up, I guess, with a sense of Canadian identity. But also definitely we have F.H. Clergue. So this chapter starts to look at Clergue coming to the Sioux and helping to set up the industries here, which did help the Canadian side a little bit more than the American side, but it still sort of then goes on into the later chapters, which is about 2/3 of the book, and it's talking about how we were still working together and growing together. So this book, it is a pretty short history of our 2 cities, but it's an interesting look because we are not only looking at sort of maybe just the Canadian events, but we're looking at those Canadian events compared to the American events as we go along. So we're looking at really how what was going on over here maybe affected over there, or what was going on over there sort of affected over here, how we grew up together, how we were still working together. So it is a very interesting, quick read. I would definitely recommend checking it out. The part on the 20th century, I would say, might be more of the interesting part as the sort of beginnings. It's sort of that history that is told everywhere, so you can get a little bit more of a deep dive of that in other sources. But the other parts, I would say that's where the more unique, intriguing part of this book lies. Well, that's just sort of in my opinion. So yes, definitely try and get a copy of this book. I'm not sure if they're selling it, but you can definitely check it out at the public library. Give it a quick read, and you can even email me and let me know what you think. So as always, thanks for listening. Bye.
If you enjoyed this episode, you might like our blog too. Head over to our website, Sault Museum, that's SAULT museum.ca, and look under Discover. You will find our blog, Museum Musings. We share short synopsis of influential people, historic places, and impactful events in our history. Pictures are always included, and you will be sure to learn a little something new with each post.
So today's quote comes from Views of the Sioux by Heather Ingram, illustrated by Graham Smith. This is a quote from our former mayor, Honorable Ron A. Irwin. Quote, "The legend in Anishinaabe, or Ojibwe culture, tells of a giant crane looking for a place to land. The place he chose was the rapids where the Canadian Lock is now located. This became the center of the Ojibwe Empire, where some 2,000 natives would meet and fish. Francis H. Clerg's vision of the future would center around this very place, and the sandstone excavated from the canal at the turn of the century would be used in the construction of many family dwellings in our historical city, and indeed of many Sault Ste. Marie historical landmarks." End quote.